Jacob never thought he'd be the type to chase ghost stories. He wasn't into the whole creepy urban exploration scene. At least, not until last week when his brother Tim sent him a link to a message board filled with locations that aren't on maps. It was the kind of forum that thrived on conspiracy theories, lost places, and whispers of things that shouldn't exist. Scrolling through half-heartedly, Jacob's attention drifted until a familiar name hit him like a punch to the gut. Milton Elementary. That was their school. The school that had burned down when they were kids. The one they had barely survived. But the post wasn't about some charred ruin. According to the message board, Milton Elementary still stood, untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. Jacob's fingers hovered over the screen, memories stirring that he wasn't sure he wanted to relive. He called Tim immediately. "We gotta see this," Jacob had said, half joking, half terrified. And because they were brothers, the next weekend found them driving down the forgotten back roads of their childhood. "Can't believe we're doing this," Tim muttered as they pulled up to the old road leading to the school. The road was overgrown, barely recognizable, but the large brick building in the distance was unmistakable. Milton Elementary stood there, looming, whole. Not a single scorch mark marred its red bricks. The windows gleamed in the afternoon sun. The playground equipment still swinging gently in the breeze, as though someone had just given them a push. Tim's grip tightened on the steering wheel. No way. We saw this place burn down. Jacob felt a knot form in his chest. The fire had been seared into their memories, flames licking the sky, the suffocating smoke, the chaos as teachers screamed for students to get out. The two of them had made it. Barely. The others, most of them, hadn't. But now, it was like the fire had never happened. "We're here now," Jacob said, his voice wavering. "Let's check it out." Yeah. The air grew colder as they walked through the front doors. The interior was pristine, just like the outside. Desks in perfect rows, chalkboards wiped clean. Old flyers still fluttered on the walls, advertising the school fair, dated decades ago. They walked in silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them with every step. There was something wrong with this place, something more than just the eerie preservation of it all. Memories started to churn in Jacob's mind, disjointed and fuzzy. Why couldn't he remember more details about the fire, about what happened after? They reached room 104. "Here we are," Tim whispered, his voice tight with unease. Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine as he peered inside. The room looked exactly as it had on that last day. The desks were arranged in perfect rows, as if awaiting students who would never return. At the teacher's desk sat a woman, her back turned to them, busy with something on the desk. Mrs. Larson. No, it couldn't be. She turned slowly, a soft smile on her lips. "You boys are late." Jacob's heart pounded. She looked just the same, but not. Her skin was too pale, too perfect. And her eyes, there was something off about her eyes. Tim took a step back. This isn't real. Jacob's legs felt like they had turned to stone. His gaze locked with Mrs. Larson's, and for a moment, everything in the world seemed to narrow into her eerie, unnatural smile. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "You've been skipping class, Jacob. That's not allowed." The air in the room grew thick, heavy with something that felt wrong on a fundamental level. Her smile stretched unnaturally wide as she stood, her body moving with a strange stiffness. Jacob's heart raced as she approached, her once familiar face now shifting, decaying. "Time to learn, Jacob," she whispered, her voice crackling with something ancient, something that didn't belong here. Before Jacob could react, Tim grabbed his arm, yanking him out of the room. They bolted down the hall, the walls seeming to close in on them with every step. But no matter where they ran, no matter which door they tried, they always ended up back at room 104. "This doesn't make sense," Jacob shouted, his voice trembling. Tim turned to him, pale and shaking. It's because we never left. What are you talking about? Jacob asked, fear clawing at his insides. Tim's eyes were wide, desperate. We didn't survive the fire, Jake. We died. All of us did. We've been stuck here ever since. Jacob's mind raced, struggling to make sense of it. He tried to remember the day of the fire, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. Everything slipped away, fragmented and distant. Flashes of heat, screams, smoke, and then nothing. We've been here all along, Tim said, his voice a hollow echo. And she's keeping us here. Jacob refused to accept it. No, that's not possible. But deep down, he felt it, the truth sinking into him like cold iron. The school wasn't just a building, it was a tomb, a prison where time had stopped, trapping the souls of the dead. Mrs. Larson wasn't a teacher. She was something much worse, feeding off their fear, keeping them locked in this never-ending loop. Tim shook his head. I've tried to escape, Jacob. Every time it resets. Every time I end up back here. Jacob's stomach twisted with a sickening realization. There was no way out. No matter where they ran, they'd always come back. He could hear the distant chime of a bell echoing through the halls, and with it came the same suffocating dread he felt every time they passed room 104. But Jacob wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. With a surge of determination, he ran. He ran through the hallways that twisted and turned in ways they never had before. Through doors that shouldn't have existed. Past classrooms that blurred and morphed into something unrecognizable. And yet, no matter how far he ran, room 104 always waited. You can't escape, Tim whispered from somewhere behind him, sounding defeated. Mrs. Larson stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing with that sickening, twisted smile. Class isn't over yet, Jacob. Jacob screamed, throwing everything he could find. Desks, chairs, anything to break the illusion. But nothing worked. The walls seemed to absorb his rage, bending and twisting around him. He slumped to the floor, gasping for breath, staring at the clock. The hands were frozen at 2:15, the exact time the fear had started. Is this it? He whispered. Broken. Are we stuck here forever? Tim sat beside him, his voice soft and resigned. Yeah, but it's easier if you just accept it. Jacob stared at him, his heart breaking. I can't. Tim didn't respond. He just looked away, his face unreadable. Jacob pushed himself up, his legs trembling. He couldn't accept this. He wouldn't. He turned to Mrs. Larson, who was still waiting, her face an unnerving mix of patience and hunger. Without a word, Jacob walked past her. The door didn't stop him this time. He stepped outside into the cold sunlight, feeling the weight of the air lift off him. The building collapsed behind him, crumbling to ash in silence. Jacob stood alone in the ruins of Milton Elementary, staring at the wreckage. He was free. But when he looked at his watch, the hands were still frozen at 2:15. And had he really escaped? Or was this just another part of the loop? The world around him remained silent, unmoving. And the clock kept ticking, only in his head. Story 2. I don't believe in the supernatural. I never have. Ghosts, spirits, demons. It's all a load of nonsense people tell to scare themselves. But there are things that make you question what you know. Things that gnaw at the edge of reason, making you wonder if, just maybe, there's something beyond. That email. That's what did it. No sender, no subject, just coordinates and a message. They're still waiting. No malware, no phishing link, no follow-up spam, just a location I recognized from childhood. A church barely visible from the highway, surrounded by dense forest. The type of place you might drive past 100 times but never see. I deleted it. I told myself it was some elaborate prank, or worse, a scam to lure idiots into some weird cult thing. But even as I hit delete, I couldn't shake the pull. It clung to me, that simple message. They're still waiting. I'm not one to give in to whims. But curiosity gnawed at me. I spent hours that night lying awake, thinking about the church, about the faint childhood memory of it, barely remembered from the back seat of my parents' car. I caved by morning, loaded my camera, grabbed my jacket, and drove out. The coordinates led me to a desolate stretch of road on the outskirts of town. Trees lined the narrow path like crooked fingers tangled in themselves, casting deep shadows in the late afternoon light. The church sat just beyond the tree line. Stone walls cracked, cloaked in ivy. It was worse than I imagined. More ruin than sanctuary, a relic abandoned to time. I parked. The air was thick, as though the forest held its breath. I walked toward the building, my footsteps strangely muffled by the moss-covered ground. The front door was ajar, waiting for me, just like the email said. The air inside was different, colder. I stepped into a dark silence, the kind that fills your lungs and presses in on all sides. Dust swirled in the thin beams of light seeping through cracks in the stone. The pews were overturned, broken like brittle bones. The altar sat covered in a thick blanket of grime. But then I noticed something that didn't fit. The candles, they were lit. Dozens of them lined up neatly along the altar, casting flickering light against the walls, shadows dancing in unison. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This place had been abandoned for decades. The air felt wrong, like I had stepped into a moment frozen in time. A faint sound reached my ears. At first, I thought it was wind, but it wasn't. It was music, a distant hum, like a choir, but there was something off about it. The way the notes clashed with each other, like they came from voices that weren't quite human. I stepped closer to the altar. Behind it, I noticed a door. The sound grew louder, clearer. It was coming from below. I hesitated at the door, hand trembling on the rusted handle. Curiosity or stupidity, I couldn't tell which pushed me forward. I opened the door and was met with a set of narrow stone stairs, descending into blackness. The air grew colder as I descended. The choir was unmistakable now, but their voices, God, their voices. The longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't music at all. It was a chant, a single phrase repeated over and over, too low to make out, but rising and falling in waves. The stairs creaked under my weight as I reached the bottom. The basement was a long, rectangular room. Old, rusted chairs sat in neat rows facing a single ominous object in the center, a stone well. The chanting swelled, echoing from deep within it. My pulse quickened, my mouth dry as I edged closer. The well was deep, far deeper than I expected. The stone walls disappeared into darkness, but below, there was something. A movement, subtle at first but unmistakable. Shadows shifted, crawling, and then, out of the shadows, faces emerged, twisted, contorted. Pale eyes stared up at me from the abyss. "Join us," they whispered. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my chest. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The chant grew louder, the voices overlapping, swirling in the space. "Join us! Join us!" I turned for the stairs, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic surged. I tugged at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The voices behind me grew more insistent. "Join us! Join us!" Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. A man in tattered robes, his eyes hollow and dark. The priest. "You were invited," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You must stay." "I didn't ask for this," I stammered, backing away from him. "But you did. The moment you opened that email, you accepted our invitation." I shook my head, denial thick in my throat. No, I didn't know." He smiled, a twisted, knowing smile. "They're still waiting, and now, so are you." I ran for the stairs, but the priest's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His touch was ice, freezing me to my core. "You can't leave," he whispered, his breath like frost against my skin. "You belong to the church now." With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched free from his grip and bolted up the stairs. The door wouldn't budge. I pounded against it, desperate, breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind me, the voices swelled, a tidal wave of sound. The priest's footsteps echoed up the stairs. "You're lost," he whispered. "You've always been lost." I froze, my back against the door. My mind raced. He was right. I was lost. I'd spent my whole life searching for meaning, for purpose. I'd never found it. Maybe that's why I'd come here. Maybe I'd been looking for this all along. The priest stood just a few feet away, his hand outstretched. "Join us, and you'll never be lost again." I hesitated, a part of me wanting to believe him, wanting to give in. But then I heard something, a creak behind me, the door. It had opened. I bolted through the doorway, sprinting out into the daylight. Behind me, the church rumbled, shaking, crumbling into the earth as though it had never existed. The voices faded, swallowed by the silence. I collapsed against my car, gasping for breath, my mind racing with the final terrifying thought. Had I really been invited? Or had I just walked into a nightmare?